Well, good evening, everybody. So, we looked at what the Bible means when it talks about the end of the age, or the last days. That was in week 1. And then we looked at Jesus, it's called the Olivet Discourse, the prophecy he gave on the Mount of Olives last week, the big long prophecy in Matthew 24 about the coming of a great tribulation in Judea within one generation. And what I'm going to try to do tonight is to kind of give you the basics of the entire book of Revelation, okay? We're going to look at a few things in detail. We're not going to look at very much in detail. We are basically, if I can give you the structure of the book, if I can let you know, show you what events the book was predicting, and then look at a few of the major visions in the book and show what the symbols mean, then I think you should probably be able to take that and then just apply it to the rest of the book of Revelation and work it out yourself, I think. But I mean, like, most of the world's cults are based on the book of Revelation anyway, or strange interpretations of it. So I guess it's really possible to, no matter how much information you get, it's really possible to come up with the most bizarre understanding of Revelation at all. But I'm hoping that what we'll do tonight is it will at least kind of give you a little bit of grounding as to what kind of book it is, what subject it's addressing, and the kind of way to understand the symbols behind it. So, let's go to the beginning, to our little introduction. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to, you know how usually I do two sections with a coffee break in the middle? I'm going to do that, but each of the two sections I'm going to split in half as well, because they just naturally break in half. So we will do like about 30 minutes, and then I will ask you that terrible question, does anyone have any questions, right? And I will give just a few minutes for that, and then we'll move on to the second half and then stop for the coffee break. I'm just going to break each of the two sections in half. So here we go. Revelation generation. Who was the generation it was written to? And the book of Revelation, exactly like the prophecy we looked at last week, Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24, the book of Revelation is also about the soon approaching tribulation and the symbols it contains of apocalyptic prophecy. So let me just pause here and say this. Jesus in Matthew 24, Jesus said that, we don't know exactly, probably about 32 AD, round about then. And he said then that his prophecy would be fulfilled within one generation. This generation will not pass away before all these things take place. The book of Revelation was written over 30 years later, probably about 66 AD, and we'll look at the various debates about when it was written in a moment. And by that time, it does not say this generation will not pass away, but it says repeatedly that take note of these things, for they shall happen soon. For the time is soon. For these events are near. And I'm always amused when I hear people trying to explain how soon means 2,000 years, you know? And then they'll say things like, you say, but it says it would be fulfilled soon. Yes, but God's ways are not your ways, and God's clock's not the same as your clock. Yeah, but if God is speaking to me, if God is speaking to human beings, and he knows to human beings what the word soon means, he's not going to suddenly take a word that we know what it means and then decide to put a completely different meaning on it and not tell us. That would be like saying everywhere that the Bible uses the word foot, your foot, Satan shall be crushed under your feet, or how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Yeah, I know God says feet, but really he means head. You say, well, no, he doesn't. If he says feet, he means feet. And if he says soon, he means soon. I mean, I just don't know how much simpler it can be than that. So here we go. The book of Revelation is the last book in the New Testament, the last book in the Bible. And And it's not called Revelation, and it is definitely not called Revelations with an S at the end. Everybody seems to want to call it that. As it says in Revelations, like the book of Psalms or something like that, its actual full title is The Revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, once you know that, it puts a lot, and what that means, it puts a lot into context. So let's have a look at that. The revelation of Jesus Christ. Of course, Christ means the Messiah. Okay? The word revelation is actually, maybe a better way to translate it would be the apocalypse. In fact, in a lot of languages, the book of Revelation is called the apocalypse. Just in English, I think English is the only one that calls it Revelation. And an apocalypse is something really interesting. It's very different from how we understand it. Because today people use the word apocalyptic a lot, and they'll say, a great storm of apocalyptic proportions is coming to the East Coast or something like that. And they'll use this word apocalyptic as if the word apocalyptic means destruction and chaos and stuff like that. Apocalyptic movies are all about the end of the world or about an actor saving us from the end of the world. That's what they're all about. They're all about some catastrophe that is so great that it's in danger of ending the world. That is not what the word apocalypse means. That is not what the word apocalyptic means. It's very simple. It means to unveil. To unveil. So, if I was to take this bit of paper, if I wanted to hide my face from you, I have veiled it. If I want to reveal my face to you, I have unveiled it. Lots of us think that the book of Revelation is God speaking to humanity, but somehow or other hiding the meaning of what he's saying, so that only the really intelligent people and people with calculators that can add up numbers and so on can somehow or other work out what the book means. But it is not a book of veiled meanings. It's the exact opposite. It is the unveiling, or to unveil or to reveal. So the title is The Unveiling of Jesus the Messiah. It is not a book about the end of the world. It is not a book about some great cataclysm. It is definitely not a book about the Antichrist, because the word Antichrist isn't mentioned a single time in the book of Revelation. And yet, I've done this test, I can't do it now because I've just said that, but I've done this test a lot with Christians. I've said in seminars and things like that, what book of the Bible speaks the most about the Antichrist? And everyone says Revelations, which doesn't exist, right? So I say, show me one of the places in Revelations where it talks about the Antichrist. And nobody can find it because it's not there. Because the word Antichrist is only mentioned in 2 books of the Bible. The first letter of John and the second letter of John. And we'll look at that next week. But John is very clear that the Antichrist is not a dictator who will rule the world. It is the Antichrists, plural, are anyone who believes this particular false doctrine that he talks about. And he says that they were at work in his day and age in the first century. I'll tell you exactly who they were next week and what they believed and so on. So it was like a cult. It was a Gnostic cult that existed in the first century that were spreading a false teaching. That is the only place it's mentioned. And it's very clear when you read the words in context. He says, this is how we know it is the last hour, for antichrists have appeared. And that is the context. It's a religious false teaching. It's nothing to do with a world dictator. It's nothing to do with the European Union or Russia coming down and invading Israel or Obama declaring martial law or any of the other things that we hear about. It's got nothing to do with a politician. It's got nothing to do with the Pope. And it's got nothing to do with a character who shall arise in our day and age. And in the book of Revelation, it's got nothing to do with the book of Revelation at all. The word Antichrist has got nothing to do with the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is not God speaking to us in veiled words about the Antichrist. The book of Revelation is God unveiling Jesus the Christ. It's an unveiling of the finished work of Jesus Christ and how the old covenant has passed away and a new covenant, a new age, a new kingdom has been ushered in through the finished work of Jesus Christ. And that is basically what it's all about. And so it's an unveiling. It's a revealing of Jesus Christ. And now, to us, the book of Revelation seems strange. It seems unusual. And we start reading it and thinking, oh, I wonder what this could mean. I wonder what that could mean. That's why, because the symbols are unfamiliar to us, that is why we wonder if it's got these hidden meanings. But it wasn't written to you and me. It was written to the 7 churches in Asia Minor that existed in the first century. Okay? It says that at the beginning. To the 7 churches in Asia Minor. It says that. And then it names the 7 cities that these 7 churches were in. And so it was written to real people who lived in real cities in a real geographical area, what we call Turkey today. And they were members of real churches in those cities. And they were getting revelation while John was on the island of Patmos. So it kind of goes like this. If this is the Mediterranean area, Italy comes down like a wee boot there, and so on. Israel's over here. If this is Turkey, this is the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. There's Cyprus, funny shaped island there. And that's Greece there. So if this area is Turkey, that was called Asia Minor. And in those days, it had cities all over the place, and there were 7 cities, and there's a little island here called Patmos. Patmos was like a prison island. It was like an island where people were exiled to, and John was sent to Patmos because of his preaching of the gospel. And while he is there, he is in prayer, he is in the Spirit. God begins to show him things. He begins to write these things down, and he sends them, because there's boats that come backwards and forwards, and he sends them out to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. He is writing to those people who were alive in 66 AD, okay? And so they have a context to all of this. And not only do they have a context to what they're reading, they also understand the genre that it is written in, that it is an apocalypse. And so there were many apocalypses. An apocalypse was a very common form of religious writing for about 200 years, from about 100 BC all the way up to about 100 AD. For about those 200 years, apocalypses were very common. They were common amongst Jews, and they were also common amongst Christians. So there's the apocalypse of Adam. There's the apocalypse of Baruch. Remember in the Old Testament, Jeremiah had a scribe called Baruch. Well, there is an apocalypse ascribed to Baruch. There is the apocalypse of Paul. There's the apocalypse of Philip. And the apocalypse of Paul is supposed to be the revelation he had. When he talks in 2 Corinthians about being caught up out of his body into the third heaven and seeing things that he couldn't speak about and so on. That's what the apocalypse of Paul is supposed to be about. One of the most famous ones, and one which is actually quoted in the Bible, is the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch is quoted in Jude. And in fact, in Jude, the book of Jude, it actually quotes Enoch chapter 2. Let me just find chapter 2 here. Here's what it says in Enoch chapter 2. Behold, he comes with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon them and destroy the wicked and reprove all of flesh for everything which the sinful and ungodly have done and committed against him. That is Jude. That is quoted in Jude, verse 14 and verse 15. And it says there that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these people. About what people? About people that were alive in his day and age. And said, and then he quotes this. And so the book of Enoch is quoted, it's actually quoted a couple of places, 2 or 3 places in the New Testament. And in fact, you know how Jesus' favorite figure of speech to speak about himself was the Son of Man? Well, that phrase, the Son of Man, comes mainly from 2 places, from the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, the second half of the book of Daniel, is also an apocalypse. And also it comes from the book of Enoch. In fact, let me just read you, because this was read by the Jews of Jesus' day and by the early Christians. One portion of them shall look upon another. Now, when I read this is going to sound kind of book of Revelation-ish, okay? It says, they shall be astonished and shall humble their countenance, and trouble shall seize them, when they shall behold this Son of a woman sitting upon the throne of his glory. Then shall the kings, the princes, and all who possess the earth glorify him who has dominion over all things. Him who was concealed from eternity, the Son of Man was concealed, whom the Most High preserved in the presence of his power. And now he has revealed, now he has unveiled, now he has apocalypsed him unto his elect. He shall sow the congregation of the saints and of the elect, and all the elect shall stand before him in that day. All the kings and princes, the exalted, and those who rule over the earth shall fall down on their faces before him and shall worship him. They shall fix their hopes on this Son of Man, shall pray to him, and shall petition him for mercy. So this was really quite a popular book. It was read a lot. There's a couple of Christian denominations that actually have this as part of the Bible, as part of their canon. I think the Coptic Church does, and some of the Assyrian Aramaic churches of the East do as well. Also, for instance, there's things in this that you would say, why can't they just put it in normal language? So, here is talking about the sun and the moon traveling through their circuits, and day and night coming and so on. And here's what it says about the moon. It says, and after this law I beheld another law. The first law was the law of the sun. This is the law of the moon. Another law of an inferior luminary, the name of which is the moon, and the orb of which is as the orb of heaven. And listen to this. Listen to how it describes the moon. Its chariot, which it secretly ascends, the wind blows, and light is given to it by measure. Every month, at its exit and entrance, it becomes changed, and its periods are as the periods of the sun. When in like manner its light is to exist, its light is a 7th portion of the light of the sun. And then it starts talking about the moon, and then earlier on it talked about the sun going through all these gates, these 12 gates that it passes through. Now, a little later on tonight, when we get to this picture of the New Jerusalem, when it talks about there being 12 gates in apocalyptic language are the 12 ages or the 12 signs of the zodiac through which the moon passes every month, through which the sun passes every age. Those are the gates. So when it talks about, I saw the New Jerusalem and it had 12 gates and each one was like a pearl, to us we think, oh, the streets must, there must be jewels and diamonds in heaven and the gates must, and we call it the pearly gates. but it says each one is a single peril. A peril in apocalyptic books is the moon. And the peril of the moon passes through the 12 gates of the 12 constellations of the zodiac. It's talking about the heavens up there. And so you say, well, why doesn't it just say it in plain English? Well, it wasn't written in English, so there you go. That's the first reason. But the second reason is because all of those figures of speech were very commonly known in those days. There was, if you like, a common apocalyptic language. And people understood what these words meant. So, an apocalypse then, which means to unveil, what an apocalypse is it is a prophecy, but a prophecy written in the language of symbols, okay? It's a prophecy written, not in plain speech, but in the language of symbols. And the symbols that it uses are the same symbols that are used throughout the entire Old Testament, over and over again. So, when you read the book of Revelation and you find a symbol, the way to understand what that symbol means is not to go to today's newspaper and to find out what's happening in the news and with global warming and with politicians and with the economic system and see if you can tie any of these things in. I mean, I've seen that happen again and again. One of the symbols in Revelation is these great insects, great locusts that come out of the pit, and they've got, they're a certain color, and they've got wings, and they've got stings like fire. And I've seen people trying to find pictures of jet fighters that might look a little bit. These are jet fighters flying over the horizon. Could you imagine anyone in the first century living in the Asia Minor, in one of the 7 churches, being even remotely interested in what a jet fighter in 2,000 years' time is going to be? Why would he have written to people in Asia Minor in the first century about jet fighters in the 21st century? What would be the point of that? It would be meaningless, totally meaningless. And it would be as meaningless as you writing a letter to someone and it meaning nothing to them whatsoever, and them having to put it in a safety deposit box and passing it down their will for 2,000 years until some distant relative finds it and reads it and says, oh, now I know what this letter means. Why would you do that? What would be the point of that? It would be completely meaningless. One of the most important principles in Bible interpretation is called audience relevance. What relevance would this have to the original audience? And if it would be completely irrelevant to the original audience, then it's obviously a misunderstanding. Fighter jets would be completely irrelevant to the original audience, who are the 7 churches in Revelation. It would have no relevance at all. So, it can't be what is meant. So the apocalypse of Jesus Christ simply means an unveiling of the prophecy of Jesus Christ, explained in the language of well-known prophetic symbols. An unveiling of the prophecy of Jesus Christ, explained in the language of symbols. So, you remember last week when we looked at the prophecy of Christ. Remember I said last week, at least I think I said this, if I said the Lord's Prayer, you would immediately think of our Father in heaven. But the Lord, Jesus, prayed lots of prayers. But we know that that is like the major prayer that he taught to his disciples. So that becomes the Lord's Prayer. If I said Jesus' most important sermon, you would instantly think of the Sermon on the Mount. It's the only sermon in the Gospels of Jesus that lasts for a few chapters. Most of the other teachings of Jesus in the Gospels are in the form of parables and whole lists of parables, and sometimes just incidents that occur when he meets someone and they ask him a question and then he begins to talk to them then. It's not really a sermon. So most of Jesus' teaching, public teaching, is in the form of parables or in the form of answering questions, and then there's his private explanations to his disciples. But as far as like sermons go, the only real sermon that we have written down in the Gospels is the Sermon on the Mount. So we know that the Lord's Prayer would be a certain prayer. His sermon would be a certain sermon. And the only extended prophecy we have from him is Matthew 24 and 25. And the structure goes something like this. It's, in this generation, there is going to be certain things. In this generation, Jesus is saying there's going to be tribulation. There's going to be the destruction of the temple. There's going to be wars and famines, wars, etc., right? But then Jesus talks about a great period of time. You know, in his prophecy, he talks about there then being a great period of time. He begins to tell parables after talking about these things. And then he says, all of his parables are about how the bridegroom, you know, they're waiting for the bridegroom to come, but the bridegroom has been delayed a long time in his coming. Or he tells a parable about the man who travels away to a far country to be made king, and he's away for a long time. So the owners of the land don't believe that he's coming back again, so they begin to become evil and so on. But he does eventually come back. And so this generation, and then there's a long time. And the long time ends with the return of Christ. By the way, one of the interesting things about the book of Enoch, which of course was written before the time of Jesus, is that when it's talking about this Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man, and it talks about the same images as Daniel, seated on the throne of glory, coming in the clouds of glory, it actually at one point mentions the first coming of the Son of Man and the second coming of the Son of Man, which is a really interesting thing because that it is never said in the Old Testament that clearly. But anyway, his return, resurrection, and final judgment. So Jesus says there's going to be, in this generation, these things are going to happen, then there's going to be a long time, and then these things are happening. Now, the book of Revelation follows exactly the same pattern, except it says, soon these things are going to happen. There's going to be tribulation. There's going to be the destruction of the temple. It talks about the temple being destroyed and riders and horses coming in and so on. It talks about wars taking place. And then also, there's a long time, which in the symbolic language of apocalypses is called 1,000 years. And then after that comes the final return, the final resurrection, the final judgment. So it follows the same pattern. That's what we're going to see as we look on. So, I've said that about the Sermon on the Mount and so on. If we were to talk about the sermon of Jesus Christ, we'd be talking about the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer. And the important thing, there's one other difference with the book of Revelation. In Jesus' prophecy, he is mainly talking about Judea. Okay? But in the book of Revelation, it extends that to Asia Minor. And I should do that in a different color. This one, because it's the book of Revelation. Right, okay. So it's talking about Asia Minor. And it does talk about what's happening in Judea, but it says that these things are going to spill over into the Asia Minor area, which is exactly what happened. So, Jesus, what Jesus predicted and prophesied was that the end of the age would happen within 40 years. Now, if that was Jesus' prophecy, and if Revelation is an unveiling of Jesus' prophecy in the language of symbols, then that is what the book of Revelation is about too, and it quite clearly is. The book of Revelation is not specifically about our day and age or our future. It's about the same things that Jesus' prophecy was about. Only it amplifies it, it gives it greater detail, it explains it more fully. In fact, by the time Revelation was written, during the reign of Emperor Nero, there were only a few years left until those climatic events. So no longer the one generation that Jesus had prophesied, almost one generation earlier. No, this prophecy would happen very soon. So if you look at that bit that says the beginning of Revelation, this is how the book starts. It says, the revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants what must soon take place. That's the very first verse of the book. I mean, do you think that's given us a hint that it's been fulfilled? This is not even an interpretation. The very first verse of the book says these things shall soon take place. And then, just in case you didn't catch that, the very end of the book says, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. And then between those two, there are numerous times throughout the book that it says that the prophecies will be fulfilled soon and will be fulfilled near. Now, just one little thing. I've got a little footnote there about the dating of the book of Revelation. Sometimes, if you get a Bible and you open it up and it's a study Bible, sometimes it'll have a first page and it will say this book, if 1 Corinthians was written by Paul, we think it was written about such and such AD. He wrote it from such and such a town. He sent the scroll by such and such a person who then traveled to Corinth and delivered it. Sometimes you'll get those little introductions. One of the interesting things about the book of Revelation is there are two completely contradictory things that you will read in study Bibles about when Revelation was written. Some study Bibles will say Revelation was written in 66 AD, and other ones will say it was written in 96 AD. Now that's quite a difference. I mean, that's 30 years of a difference. And we know that the Apostle John lived until he was 80 years old, or in his 80s anyway. So, and we also know that he lived for a number of years after Revelation was written. Because after Revelation was written, he left Patmos, he came back to Asia Minor, he lived in Ephesus, and it was once he got back to Ephesus that he realized that the Gnostic antichrists were spreading their teaching. And so from Ephesus, he wrote the first letter of John, the second letter of John, and the third letter of John. So he lived for a few years after that. So if he wrote Revelation in 96 AD, and we know that he lived for a number of years after Revelation was written, he must have still been alive round about 100 AD. And if he was 84 years old, we know he was in his 80s, that means that, let me think, I didn't mean to calculate this, I'm not good with math. If Jesus was baptized in 30 AD, if he would have been 16 when would he have been 16? He would have been 16 in 30 AD, would he? That's not right, is it? If he was 84, no, he would have been 16 in 1 AD, wouldn't he?
Subtract 84 off 100, which is 16.
So he would have been born in 16 AD.
So he would have been born in, thank you. He would have been born in 16 AD, which would have meant that in 30 AD, he was 14 years old. And one of the things that we know for sure, any Bible scholar will tell you, was the Apostle John, different from many of the other apostles, had some aristocratic background. He came from a wealthy background. He was very familiar with the priests in the temple. He was very familiar with people who had high positions. He was very familiar with the priestly craft and so on. There is no way that he was 14 years old when Jesus was baptized, and yet somehow or other, when Jesus was he had all of this access into the temple courts in Jerusalem and into the high priest's courtyard. And I mean, he was a kid, if that was the case. So this is a silly figure. And see, people who hold to that figure, they hold it for two reasons. Reason number one, they do not want the book of Revelation to be about what I'm saying it's about, the destruction of Jerusalem. They want it to be about our future. And if it was written after 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed, if it was written after 70 AD, then it can't be talking about that, because that's already happened. So it must be talking about a new temple being built in the future, and a new Roman Empire rising up in the future, and a new persecution coming to the church in the future, and all of these kinds of things. Yes, we know all of those things happened once before, but that was just a foretaste. If this was written after those things happened and it's a prophecy, then they must be all about to happen again. That's the kind of argument that they give. Or that's one reason. Or the other reason is they don't believe in predictive prophecy at all. And so a lot of people would say, yes, of course it's about the destruction of... I mean, you just read the book and it is obviously about the destruction of Jerusalem. It mentions Jerusalem again and again. It mentions the temple again and again. But it was written after it happened, and they kind of, whoever wrote it pretended it was a prophecy, but you already knew those things had happened. So it'd be kind of like me writing about 9/11 and the Twin Towers being destroyed, but me pretending I was writing it before it happened. Oh, I see two tall towers in a giant city named after a big apple. And behold, I see birds in the sky. Steel birds fly into these towers, you know, that kind of thing. And I'm pretending that it's a prophecy that I've had before it happened. In other words, I'm just a downright charlatan and a liar. So, if you're a liberal scholar and you do not believe that predictive prophecy is true, you say whoever wrote Revelation was really writing history, but they just kind of like pretended it was prophecy. It kind of gives it more weight, you know. But then they'll say that about a lot of things. They'll say, I know the book of Ephesians says it was written by the Apostle Paul, but it wasn't written by Paul. It was written by some other person. They added Paul's name in to give it more weight. So that's the kind of thing that a liberal scholar would say. And then one of these kind of real wild-eyed end-time fanatics will say, no, it's a prophecy, and it's still to happen in the future. So it must have been written after 70 AD. It can't be about that temple. It can't be about that Roman Empire. It can't be about that emperor. There must be a revived Roman Empire in the future. There must be a new emperor that's going to arise. There must be a new temple going to be built in Jerusalem. And all these things will happen then. So people opt for 96 AD because it suits their philosophy better, whichever one of the philosophies it is. And what I find really interesting is the liberals and the hyper-fundamentalists, isn't it funny that although they argue with each other, this one claims that every word in the Bible is literally true, and this one claims that not that much is true, and yet they both interpret things exactly the same way in order to arrive at their extreme conclusions. Now, where would somebody get this date from? It comes from, there's a guy in the early church called Irenaeus, and Irenaeus wrote this sentence that it's really hard to translate from Greek into English, so I am told by Greek scholars. And it can be translated two ways. One way is, John saw the revelation during the reign of Domitian, which comes after the reign of Nero. So it comes round about this time. John saw the revelation during the reign of Domitian. The other way it can be translated is this: John, who saw the revelation, was still appearing amongst us, meaning amongst our churches, during the reign of Domitian. Well, that would be true. John was still alive but dying, in his last couple of years during the reign of Domitian. So it can be translated either that John saw the revelation during the reign of Domitian, or that John himself was still being seen during the reign of Domitian. And people argue about which one it means. I don't really care which one it means, because I take Irenaeus with a very large pinch of salt anyway. He was famous for getting all his dates and times wrong. He claimed that Jesus was in his 50s when he was crucified. And anyone who reads the Gospels can see really clearly that he was, when he was baptized, it says he was around 30 years old. And then as you read the Gospels, you can see that there are 3 Passovers covering 3 years. Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years. There was half a year and then a Passover, and then another whole year and a Passover, and then another whole year, and he's crucified at the final one. And so Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years. Well, I don't need to get my iPhone out and go onto the calculator app to know that if somebody is around 30 years old and you add 3.5 years, you don't get 52 years old. But Irenaeus did. So I don't really care what Irenaeus said. But what I know is this: the earliest manuscripts that we have of the book of Revelation are Aramaic, ancient Aramaic copies from the Aramaic New Testament called the Peshitta. And it says in that, in the ancient Aramaic manuscripts had a little title above each book. And it says here, the revelation which God revealed to John the Apostle during the reign of Nero. And that is the earliest copy of the book of Revelation we have. So I'm quite happy to go with the earliest copy of the book of Revelation rather than what Irenaeus says, who gets a lot of things wrong. And anyway, even if you do go for a 96 AD date, you still can't project the prophecy into our future, because you've still got all these soon words to deal with. So what happened? I know what happened soon after 66 AD. The temple was destroyed, and everything described came to pass. But what on earth happened soon after 96 AD? Nobody can point to anything. So if you hear this argument, and there's, I have a video on my YouTube channel. If you go into YouTube and you just type in my name, you'll find my channel. And I've got a video there. It's not by me. It's by Dr. Kenneth Gentry, who's a theologian who's an expert in this subject. And he completely proves the early date of the book of Revelation. Also, the best commentary on the book of Revelation is this one. It's by David Chilton, and it's called Days of Vengeance. And there's pages and pages on just a couple of verses, and they show all the historical background as well as everything else. So, let's just continue on. Revelation was about events about to be fulfilled in the 1st century AD. By now, the Jesus movement had spread throughout the Roman Empire, and Asia Minor in particular was being majorly impacted by this new faith. In fact, once Jerusalem was destroyed, the new faith would have no center or capital city anymore. It would be spreading like a living yeast, leavening everything it came into contact with. There would be multiple centers of the faith in Alexandria, Greece, Rome. Even northern France and the British Isles received the gospel within a few years of the resurrection of Christ. But of main importance next would be Asia Minor, because that is where so many of the new churches were being established. Incidentally, why was Asia Minor so important? Because a large number of what we call the lost tribes of Israel that were dwelling at that time in Asia Minor. If you read the book of Galatians, you'll find out that Paul, talking to them, even though we think of them as Gentiles, he continually talks to them about how their ancestors were under the law, and he quotes prophecies from the lost tribes of Israel to them. Same with 2 Peter. He says that he is writing to all of these areas of Asia Minor, and he also refers to them as lost tribes. So that was where so many of the new churches existed, and where the next attacks on the new faith would come, both from within the church in the form of dualistic Gnosticism, and from without the church in the form of imperial persecution. So the book starts with John, who is imprisoned for his faith on the island of Patmos, just off the coast of Asia Minor, writing 7 letters to the 7 major church centers in Asia Minor. And while there is much symbolic and apocalyptic language even in the 7 letters, the beginning of Revelation, these churches did exist, and he was writing to real people in real cities. Then the vision goes into heavenly realms, where John sees everything Jesus spoke of in his Olivet prophecy, but he sees it in the language of symbols. That the leaders of the Old Covenant system in these visions are now joined by pagan imperial powers, and together they persecute the new faith. And I just go on and talk a little bit more about that. So I just want to pause there for a second. I'm going to just take a minute or two to pause. And what I really want to do is I want to get into some of the images and some of the visions. But just before that's just the introduction. That's what the book's about, who wrote it, who it was written to, why it was written. Any questions about anything there? Yep.
I have a slightly off-topic question.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up with the Bible being taught by godly people
Mm-hmm.
over all these years. Are there any seminaries that are teaching this?
Okay, so this might surprise you, because it does tend to surprise people. What I'm teaching is actually the major view in the global church. That's right, because you live in North America. And that's the problem. So this is the major view in the Christian church. This is what all the reformers believed and taught. Like Charles Spurgeon would have taught this. Any of the famous people. So for the last 2,000 years, this would have been the view held. And even today, it is still the major view, with one exception in North America. And in North America, another view called dispensationalism has become the major view. And that all comes from, I think I'd mentioned Scofield's Bible and so on. So that's where it all comes from. And that was how this view kind of got displaced in North America. I mean, the Puritans and the Pilgrim Fathers that came to North America, this is the view that they believed. So this is the view that they brought to America with them. During the Great Awakening in the United States, this is the view of prophecy that was taught. Great leaders like Jonathan, what was his name again? Jonathan Edwards. I've got books that were written by Jonathan Edwards back whenever that was, during the Great Awakening, and this is what he teaches. So it's actually only in the last 200 years that in North America, dispensationalism, really through the Scofield Bible, knocked this view out. And then American missionaries began importing it all over the world. So you could go to a village in Uganda, and you'll find the pastor there teaching dispensationalism, because he's been taught that by an American missionary who's given them the Scofield Bible or something like that. So that's how you get this view elsewhere. It does exist elsewhere. It exists in Europe. It exists all over the world, but it's not the major view in those places. This is a major view elsewhere. Anything else? Oh, go ahead.
The example you gave the other day was it's raining cats and dogs.
Yeah.
1,000 years from now,
Nobody will know
they
what.
would interpret that.
Yeah. They will think either, they'll say, either this was a figure of speech, or these people were so ignorant and uneducated they thought cats and dogs fell out of the sky, or some miraculous event happened during their day and age that we don't understand, and for some reason cats and dogs fell out of the sky. And then, if somebody if someone would find one of our letters that says something about raining cats and dogs, and if they happen to believe that the person who wrote that was inspired by God, they would then have to defend it literally. And then they would find all of these examples about how, how you sometimes hear these examples that like fish fall out the sky or something because a cloud's picked up water and dumped it. And they would find all these examples and they would try to prove that somehow or other literally cats and dogs once fell out the sky because this person was inspired by God and they said it and it must be literally true. So they'll either think we're crazy or something really did happen, or hopefully they'll be intelligent enough to know this was a figure of speech. I mean, like, we use that and don't even know I don't know where it comes from. Why cats and dogs? I don't know where it comes from. I can't remember, is it Germany or Holland or there's some place in Europe that they say it's raining little cobbler boys. And you're like, what? Because it's the noise of a cobbler nailing, pop, 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 pop. That's the noise of the rain, So it's a figure of speech. And they know what that figure of speech is, and everybody who read this stuff knew what the figure of speeches were that were contained in the books. Right, I want to just, before we stop for a coffee break, I want to just look at one of the major pictures, and this is really, really important, Jerusalem, the harlot. You know how this city called Babylon, in the book of Revelation, it talks about Babylon has fallen, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Well, I have heard that Babylon was Rome, was ancient Rome. I have heard that Babylon is modern-day Rome. I've heard that Babylon is the Vatican or the Catholic Church. I've heard that Babylon is the European Union. I've heard that Babylon is the United States because the United States has a bald eagle as its symbol and the ancient Romans had an eagle as their symbol. I've heard all of these things. The interesting thing is the book of Revelation actually tells you what city it is. It says it's the city where our Lord was crucified. That wasn't the United States. That wasn't the Vatican. That wasn't any of these places. That was one place, Jerusalem. So, Jerusalem the harlot. Two cities are contrasted in Revelation, Babylon and the New Jerusalem. Babylon is the old Jerusalem, natural, physical, geographical Jerusalem. Jerusalem is referred to as a harlot, echoing the words of the Old Testament prophets who said the same thing. So, for instance, the book of Isaiah starts off by saying, woe to Jerusalem. Oh, how the faithful city has become a harlot. And so a number of times, there's quite graphic prophecies in the book of Ezekiel when the two capital cities of Israel, Samaria in the north and Jerusalem in the south, are called two sisters, and they're both harlots. And you can go and read it sometimes. It's one of these passages of Scripture that you don't want to read out in church because it talks about how big the guy's genitals are and everything else. And so these two cities are called harlots, the people of God. So, Jerusalem is a harlot because she was once married to the Lord. Hosea, the prophet Hosea, remember Hosea? The Lord tells Hosea to go and marry a harlot, and then she's unfaithful to him. And the Lord told him, she's going to be unfaithful to you, but marry her anyway. And then you've got to take her back again. He's like, oh, come on, Lord. But God says, this is a parable. This is a symbol of Jerusalem. I've been married to Jerusalem, and she goes off and plays the harlot with other gods and with other kings, and then she wants to come back, and then she leaves again, So, she was once married to the Lord, but she broke her covenant with God and committed adultery. You can see that in Revelation 17:2, 18:3, and of course Jeremiah 3:8. And she has rejected God's holy prophets and saints and even his son and killed them and will be held accountable for their blood. Right, let's read this little passage from Matthew 24, or 23 rather, that we looked at last week. And then let's read this little passage in Revelation, and you'll see they're both parallel. They're both talking about the same things. Jesus said in Matthew 23, he was talking to Jerusalem, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all of this will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. Now look at Revelation 18:24, talking about the harlot city Babylon. In her was found the blood of prophets and of God's holy people and of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. Well, Jesus was very clear in Matthew 23 that was Jerusalem that had shed all the blood of the prophets. Babylon didn't shed all the blood of the prophets. I mean, Babylon was wicked, but you think the prophet Daniel was in Babylon. Did they kill him? No. But if he'd been back in Jerusalem, they probably would have, because they killed all the prophets. So it's not the literal city of Babylon. It's not Iraq. It's Jerusalem. As a harlot who was under the law, she would be stoned to death for her adultery. So in Revelation 16:21, from the sky, huge hailstones, each weighing about 40 kilograms, fell on the people, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible. Now, Josephus tells us, I meant to bring out actually the writings of Josephus, I'll do that after the break. He tells us in his History of the Jews that when the Romans invaded Jerusalem, they used catapults with rocks, and they painted them white, like hailstones, to make them harder to see in the sky, rather than the black rock which they were using. And the weight of them is exactly the same weight, 40 kilograms. Josephus tells us was the hailstones that were used. So when the catapults were sent in, it was like, and the city was being bombarded, it was the harlot, the unfaithful adulteress under the old covenant law, was being stoned to death. Okay? And Jerusalem, the harlot, the one faithful city which now rejected God, is referred to as Babylon, and is also referred to as Sodom, and also as Egypt. All once great cities which became enemies of God and his people, who became sinful and self-righteous and violent and wicked. Jerusalem is referred to as Babylon, the mother of harlots, who has been judged and will fall. And God's people are called to come out of her, my people. Remember, Jesus, in his prophecy that we looked at last week, said that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you have to flee the city and you have to flee to the mountains. And then in Revelation, what he says is, when you know that the harlot city is about to be judged, come out of her, my people. In other words, flee from her. I've read gospel tracts that say, this Babylon is a Roman Catholic church, and if you really love Jesus Christ, you will come out of her, my people, and join a Bible-believing church. It's got nothing to do with us or our churches today. It's to do with people fleeing the city before the judgment and destruction fell upon it. So, and those who heeded Jesus' prophecy did flee from Jerusalem to the city of Pella before the Romans invaded. And by coming out from her, they managed to endure to the end of that age, and therefore they were saved and not killed with the rest of this. So he who endures to the end, again, is not. I've heard people using that to say, yes, you might have accepted Christ as your Savior, but you never know. You might backslide, you might sin, and end up in hell anyway. It's only if you endure to the end of your life that you'll be saved. That's not what it's talking about. First of all, what a weak and pathetic God we've got if he can save you and then you can actually think a thought and undo everything he's done. And what about Jesus saying, once you're in my hands, no man can take me out of No man can take you out of my hands. And even if they could, you're also in the Father's hands, and no one can take you out of the Father's hands, he said. I mean, unless a man be born again, and again, and again, and again, and every time he sins, he has to be born. I knew this guy once that thought every time he sinned, he had to be born again, or else he would go to hell, because it meant he had not endured to the end. It's about the siege of Jerusalem. It's got nothing to do with us going to heaven. It's about those who heed the prophecy, flee the city, come out from amongst the harlot city, Jerusalem, flee to the mountains like Jesus said, and wait there until the end of the siege and the end of the age in AD 70 are the ones who will survive. The ones who don't heed the prophecy, who stay in the city, who don't come out, are going to be slain, are going to be killed. Okay. So, come out as being saved. So Jerusalem is, now here's a quote, the great city. This is from the book of Revelation, chapter 11, verse 8. The great city, which is figuratively called. Oh, thank you, Lord. You're telling us that this is not literal. It is figurative, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Where was Jesus crucified? Come on. So that can only be Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Babylon. Jerusalem is Sodom. Jerusalem is Egypt. Jerusalem is the harlot in the book of Revelation. The temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed by the invasion of riders on horseback, Revelation 14 and 15. The final result would be that Babylon, or Jerusalem, would be burned with fire and destroyed completely, ending the prominence of the city as a religious center and ensuring that the new Jerusalem, the global church, would be a global community embracing all people everywhere. And Jerusalem was burned with fire. The smoke from the city ascends till the end of the age. Now, something I need to say. I am aware that some people teach that the harlot is Rome. I've heard that quite a lot. Oh, the harlot's Rome, and Rome persecuted the early Christians, and so it must be Rome and all that. But it doesn't work. Here's how it doesn't work. Rome was never married to God. Rome never had a covenant with God. Rome was never married to God. The city of Rome was never called the bride of Yahweh. It was never married to God. So how could it be accused of committing adultery against God? But Israel and Judah were married to God. They were called the bride of Yahweh. Rome is never called a harlot elsewhere in the Bible, but Israel and Judah are. Rome were never in a national covenant with God, so couldn't be judged for breaking the covenant. But Israel and Judah were. Rome didn't have a central temple which was destroyed. It had numerous pagan temples, but Jerusalem did. Rome and its emperors are pictured, as we shall see, as a great beast upon whose back the harlot gets a free ride for a period of time. Then the beast turns on the harlot and devours her in fire. How could Rome ride on the back of Rome and then turn on Rome and devour Rome with fire? Rome can't be both the harlot and the beast. And even if it could do those things, when did that happen? It didn't. It is quite clearly Jerusalem who is the harlot, because Jerusalem was once a faithful city who had now become a harlot, who had shed the blood of God's prophets and his sons, had leaders who were sucking up to Rome or riding on the back of the beast, to use the biblical language, and were given power by Rome, which they used to enrich themselves, and was eventually turned on by Rome. It was Rome who turned on Jerusalem. It was Rome who invaded Jerusalem. It was the beast who burned the harlot with fire. Okay? Eventually turned on by Rome, invaded by Rome, stoned by Rome, and devoured in fire by Rome. The harlot, Babylon, the great city, is Jerusalem. And with that, we shall stop for a coffee break. Okay? So if Babylon, if the harlot city is natural Jerusalem, is the physical city of Jerusalem, because that city was once married to God. If you read the Old Testament prophecies, you'll see lots of times where God refers to them as his bride or his wife. And he talks about them being in covenant like a marriage covenant. But they broke their covenant, they turned their back on God, they killed the prophets, they crucified the Messiah, and became a harlot. So what's the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation? Because quite often people think it's heaven. Oh, we're going to walk through the pearly gates upon the streets of gold and all of this kind of stuff. That it's heaven in the future. But, well, let's look at this one. The New Jerusalem, I've called this section, the New Jerusalem is the bride of Christ. It never says the New Jerusalem is heaven. It says, behold, I saw the New Jerusalem descending from heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. Everywhere in the New Testament that it talks about Christ's bride, it is talking about the church. The New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation is a picture of the church. Okay? And it's not, like I've seen in some drawings, it's not an actual physical city that's going to come down like a flying saucer and hover over the Middle East. I've seen those kind of pictures. I mean, it's so massive in dimensions that you do realize that nothing would grow. And I mean, there'd be no light underneath it. Nothing would grow. But anyway, you know these, what do you call that? Farrakhan, is that his name? You know, like the Nation of Islam, the Black Muslim movement in the United States. They have it as flying saucers coming down. The mothership shall come down, you know, and take us away, because it says, I saw this city coming down. So, anyway, the New Jerusalem is the bride of Christ, the people of God who have embraced the kingdom. The kingdom is God's new world and new way of living, which is emerging in our midst. Think about the parable of the wedding in Jesus' Olivet prophecy, where the bridegroom is depicted as Christ. Or these verses, Revelation 21. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues came and said to me, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. So just like Rome can't ride on the back of Rome, and Rome can't burn Rome, and Rome can't turn on Rome, heaven can't come out of heaven, you know. The angel didn't say, come, and I will show you what heaven looks like. He didn't say that. He says, come, and I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. So it is the bride of Christ. I mean, it tells us it's built on the foundation of the apostles. The church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. And in the New Jerusalem has the names of the apostles, and it has the names of the 12 patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel. And so it is built on the Old Covenant revelation and on the New Covenant apostles. And so it is the church, and yet, so in some sense, right now, we are the bride of Christ. I mean, we are the bride. Like, you know, I've heard people say, "Oh, there's going to be a wedding in the future." There must, like, people talk about we must get into prayer and we must get into intimacy with the Lord, like a bride and the bridegroom, and then they say we're not married yet, so we'll be fornicating with Jesus. Do you know what I mean? I mean, like, if we are not the bride of Christ, we should not be getting into any intimacy with the bridegroom. If the wedding is some point in the future, oh, there's going to be a wedding feast one day. No, there's not. There was a wedding feast one day. Do you know, when Jesus died on the cross and his side was pierced and the water flowed, when he died on the cross, he was giving birth, so to speak, to the church, the bride of Christ. Just like Adam's bride was taken from his side, Christ's bride was taken from his side. When Jesus died on the cross, it was finished. It's not going to be finished in the future. We are now the bride of Christ. And the church is called the bride of Christ. So, and yeah, although we are now the bride of Christ, which means we are now in the New Jerusalem, because it's a symbol, it's not a literal city, it's a symbolic picture. We are now in the New Jerusalem. And yet, when you see the picture of the New Jerusalem, it's actually showing you the church in its final fullness. When the whole, not just the whole earth, but it's actually, it pictures the whole cosmos. The 12 gates are a symbol of the entire cosmos, because that's the 12 signs of the zodiac. They keep the ages going round again and again. I've told you about the peril being the moon going through it and so on. It's about the entire cosmos now being brought into, all his enemies are a footstool for his feet. It has cosmic proportions. It symbolizes the redemption of the entire cosmos, the entire created order. By the way, an interesting thing. It talks about all the, Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem is laden down with gold and jewels and pearls and all of this costly stuff. And in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, he describes it as the cement being made out of eyeshadow and stuff like that. The properties that he talks about being used is all cosmetics. I don't know if you know this, but the word cosmetics comes from the word cosmos. It's exactly the same thing. The cosmos is when everything in creation is arranged in its correct order. And cosmetics are when someone is defining their, you get a lip pen. Well, I don't, but you get a lip pen. And you you define the outline of the lip. And then you get lipstick and you color in the outline of the lip. One thing I did used to do, I used to wear black eyeliner when I was a teenager, but then that was just the thing then in Europe. I stopped doing it when a guy tried to pick me up one night in a bar. So, it is the entire cosmos adorned cosmetically like a bride for her husband. The bride is the opposite of the harlot. The bride is pure, the bride is chaste. And the bride is actually not just at the end when the bride is called the New Jerusalem, but the bride is depicted earlier in the book of Revelation as well, in Revelation 12. Chapter 12. Israel, the people of God, were depicted in the Old Testament using the symbols of the sun, moon, and stars. The Messiah. So let me read this and we'll read the passage. Remember Genesis 37? Remember when Joseph has a dream and he tells his brothers and his father the dream, and he said, I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to me. And his father says, what, are your 11 brothers, who are the 11 stars, making Joseph the 12th, are your 11 brothers and me and your mother, the sun and the moon, all going to bow down to you? The father instantly knew the interpretation of the dream, that Joseph was saying that the sun and the moon and the stars symbolized the patriarchs of Israel, who would then become the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Israel is depicted right back at its very beginning. It's depicted in a dream as the sun and the moon and 12 stars. Later on in the book of Jeremiah, and other places too, but I've put a Jeremiah quote here, he talks about how God has a covenant with Israel which is symbolized in the sun and the moon and the stars. And so when in Revelation 12 we see a picture of a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. She is Israel. She ain't the Virgin Mary. She's Israel. Well, she could be partly the Virgin Mary. She is Israel, depicted as a woman, because through a woman of Israel shall come the Messiah. So she's Mary in that sense. But like Mary does not have a crown on her head. She is not the Queen of Heaven and all that kind of stuff. That's not what it's talking about. This is a picture of Israel. Israel is this woman in Revelation 12. Israel, through Israel, the Messiah would come. In fact, through a woman in Israel. That's why it's not a man that has the sun and the moon and the 12 stars. It's a woman that has the sun and the moon. Because way back from the beginning of the Bible, it was prophesied that the seed of a woman, the offspring of a woman, would come and crush the serpent's head. In the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Now we're in the last book in the Bible, Revelation, and instead of a serpent, he's a dragon. Someone's been feeding this dude. He starts off as a serpent, he ends up as a dragon. And there's a woman whose offspring will crush the head of the serpent. And in Revelation, the dragon knows this, so he's waiting to kill, to devour the offspring of this woman the moment it's born. But he's not able to do so. And that, by the way, is also a constellation. The constellation Draco or Draconis, the dragon. It's not one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, but it is a constellation up there. And the woman is the constellation Virgo. Because not only would Israel bring forth the Messiah, not only would a woman of Israel bring forth the seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. So it's Israel, it's a woman from Israel, but it's even more specific. It's a virgin woman in Israel. Because it was prophesied that a virgin shall conceive and give birth to a child. And so this is the constellation Virgo, which incidentally does have 12 stars. But also the 12 stars symbolize the 12 constellations. This is the constellation Virgo symbolizing Israel using Old Testament images and saying that from Israel, the Messiah would be born from a virgin woman of Israel, and that the dragon, which it calls Satan, would try to kill, and the dragon has many heads, and it's one of its heads that tried to kill the child. Because the devil works through people. And in this case, the devil works through heads of state. And it was a head of state, it was a king, that the devil worked through to try to kill Jesus when he was born, King Herod. King Herod, who was an Edomite, whose favorite color was red, the symbol of the Edomites was red, and the dragon is red. And so this red dragon, this devil, is working through a head of state, through King Herod, to kill the baby Messiah the moment he's born, but fails in his mission. Incidentally, during the conception of Jesus, if you go back, we don't know exactly when Jesus was born, but maybe certainly in the vicinity of a year to 8 months or so before Jesus was born, so round about the time Jesus was being conceived. You can do this on computers. You can look at the night sky over Bethlehem, and you can begin to turn it back, and look what the sky looked like at the time of Jesus' conception. Do you want to know what it looked like? The constellation Virgo was in the sky, and she was clothed with the sun. The sun entered Virgo and impregnated her when Jesus was conceived. And then again, at Jesus' crucifixion, remember it says that, the sky went dark and all of that kind of stuff. We know by looking back, a blood moon took place. And the blood moon was at the feet of the constellation Virgo at the same time that Mary, the mother of Jesus, would have been taking his bloody body down from the cross. So this is not just a symbol. It actually literally happened in the night sky at the conception of Jesus and at the death of Jesus. And so Herod, the devil is working through Herod to try to kill the child, but he's not able to do so. And being a vision, it doesn't then give us all the 33 years of Jesus' life. It just jumps straight to the ascension, and the child is caught up to heaven. And then it says that the dragon is mad about this, and he wants to attack the woman. But she flees to a safe place in the wilderness. This is exactly what happened when the Christians, believing Jesus' prophecy, fled to Pella. And they were protected there, and they were kept safe. And the dragon, or the heads of state, General Titus and Emperor Nero, were not able to go and defeat them. And so then, because they weren't able to do that, it says, then the dragon was angry about that and decided to persecute the woman's other children. And it specifies those who have believed in Jesus Christ. And that was why the persecution moved to Asia Minor, and then because there was a lot of Christians there, and then eventually it moved to the city of Rome when they began to throw Christians to the lions and stuff like that. So this picture of the bride of Christ, she's the bride of Christ, the church, the people of God, is depicted as a new city, a new Jerusalem at the end, but it's also depicted as this woman clothed with the sun, with the moon, because the people of God, believers in the Old Testament are the people of God as well as believers in the New Testament, and it's a continuation of what that is. Let's just actually have a read at the prophecy. I think I've got it somewhere. Here it is. A great sign, Revelation 12, the woman and dragon. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. Stars falling to the earth in Old Testament prophecies and in apocalyptic prophecies is always used as a symbol of cities and nations falling. Babylon falling is like stars falling out the sky. Edom falling is like stars falling out the sky. All of these prophecies. This is the Roman Empire rising up. This is, and it's sweeping all other nations into, out of their position of authority, and it's becoming the prominent one. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so it might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, Pella, to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of. For how long? For exactly 3.5 years. You'll see that on 3 occasions in the book of Revelation, it mentions that this time of tribulation would last 3.5 years. Here it calls it 1,260 days. Elsewhere it calls it 40 whatever months. What would that be? 12, 20, 24, 36, and 6, 42 months. And then elsewhere it uses prophetic language and it calls it time, times, and half a time, which is 3.5 years. 1 time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is half a year. And so on 3 occasions in the book of Revelation, it says that this time of great tribulation would last 3.5 years. Halfway through 66 AD to the end of 70 AD was the 3.5 year tribulation period. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough. They lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient snake called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah." For this is not about some war in heaven before the creation of the world. This is after the Messiah is born, okay? And the authority of our Messiah, for the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They triumph over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They do not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows his time is what? Not 2,000 years. He is called the accuser of the brethren. And because he's able, remember in the book of Job, he's able to accuse Job before God. But there's a difference here now. The difference is that the Messiah has come, Jesus Christ has come, he has died for our sins, he has paid the price, we are forgiven as far as God is concerned, our sins are blotted out, and any of the devil's power to accuse us before God has been cast down, has been overthrown. The devil cannot go to God and say, yeah, but what about that sin that she committed last week? God says, what sin? As far as the east is from the west, I have taken her sins away. I have cast them in the sea of forgetfulness. I have chosen to remember her sins no more. We cannot be accused before God. And therefore, don't let the accuser accuse you in your own heart and in your own mind. You are forgiven. You are free from that, okay? Anyway, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. Of course, the woman, she was given 2 wings of a great eagle so she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of. How long? For times, and half a time, out of the snake's reach. That was when the believers, the Israelite believers in Jesus, fled from Jerusalem and went to hide in Pella. Then from his mouth, the snake spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away in a torment. But the earth helped the woman, opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out. All of the armies that went after her eventually turned back. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. That is the Christian persecution that then broke out after that. So, that's the woman and the dragon, the bride of Christ. Now, one of the big pictures in the book of Revelation is the beast. Well, actually, there's 2 beasts. There's the beast from the sea and the beast from the land. And what we're going to discover is, and of course, people know about this because they know about the mark of the beast and the number of the beast. Who was it? Was it Iron Maiden that sang 666? Yeah. And they had, what was that actor called that they had to do the voiceover? Remember? He was the old... yeah, it was. Was it? Well, I can't remember who it was. It was one of these old horror movie actors anyway. Reading from the book of Revelation in a scary voice. And we have all of these depictions in music and in film about the number of the beast and the beast being this monster in the future. Well, let's have a look. There's 2 beasts. And the 2 beasts are imperial Rome, or the Caesars, and religious Rome, or the pagan religion. Revelation 13. There are 2 great beasts in the book of Revelation. The beast from the sea and the beast from the land. The first beast from the sea is a symbol of the Roman emperor. This beast has 10 heads and crowns. These are the heads of state that ruled the region, the Roman emperors. The beast particularly is Nero. By the way, the general that was sent with the Roman armies to destroy Jerusalem in AD 70 was a guy called General Titus. He later on became a Caesar. He became an emperor of Rome, and he was the 10th head of the Roman Empire, which is interesting. But the beast specifically is Nero. This beast arises out of the sea. Now, the sea we're talking about is the Mediterranean Sea. Remember the little map we had here? The island of Patmos is in the Mediterranean Sea. It's not in the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. It's not talking about any other sea. It's talking about that sea. And it was from the Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean area, that the Roman Empire arose. Okay? And Nero was so insanely violent and hated by his own citizens. And go on watch the History Channel or whatever sometime and watch there's good documentaries about Nero. I mean, the guy was like bad news. Like, he raped his mother. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He tried to kill his mother on a couple of occasions. He did things I won't even talk. He did horrible things, right? Horrible things. So, he was so insanely violent and hated by his own citizens that they referred to him, there's non-Christian Roman writings, where they refer to him as that great beast in Rome. And they're talking about Nero. They call him a beast. Also, he recruited the pagan priests in the temples of Asia Minor to help him with his persecution of the Christians, many of whom he beheaded. For instance, the Apostle Paul died because he was beheaded by Nero. So when you read in the book of Revelation about people being persecuted and beheaded, and I've seen some people online trying to tie this in with ISIS and saying, but it's talking about what happened at that time. And beheadings were very common. What Nero, the beast from the sea, and his pagan priests of the imperial cult, the beast from the land, did was so what they did was this. There were places called the Agora. And then the Agora was kind of like a city square, and there were political gatherings that happened there, a whole lot of things, but also the marketplace happened there. And in the entrance into the Agora, Nero recruited, what he did was he brought back emperor worship. Emperor worship had died out. It had been part of the Roman Empire before, where people would worship the emperor and call him God, but then it died out, but he brought it back again. Revelation depicts it dying out as the head was fatally wounded, but it came back to life again. The worship of the emperor was fatally wounded. It was wiped out, and then he brought it back again and had statues of himself, and he really didn't like, one of the things he didn't like were the Christians said, Jesus is Lord. So he had on his statues, Nero is Lord. And they set up these statues at the entrance to the marketplaces. And he got the priests to put a bowl of incense in front of it, kind of powdered incense that was burning and smoking in front of it. And in order, you couldn't get into the marketplace unless you stood in front of the statue, took some of the ash of the incense, so your hand was now dirty with ash, took some of the ash, wiped it on your head, and says, Nero is Lord. If you had the mark of the beast on your hand and head and stood before the image of the beast, you were then allowed into the marketplace. If you refused to worship the image of the beast or take the mark of the beast or speak the name of the beast, Nero was Lord, the name, the image, and the mark, if you refused to do that, it could only mean you were a Christian. Because all the other religions were quite happy to do it. There was lots of different religions. You could believe any religion you wanted, as long as you also acknowledged the emperor. But the Christians wouldn't do that. And so, here's another thing. And again, History Channel have a great documentary about this. And I know it's on YouTube. I can't remember what it's called. But they have a great documentary. It's not about Nero, but it is about the pagan temples of ancient Rome. And they show how archaeologists have discovered that one of the things that the priests did, they were really, really clever. They actually, when they made statues of the gods, they actually built mechanics all inside them as well. And they built a hollow inside. So if you went into the temple of Apollo and you said, and you prayed to, oh Apollo, I need a sign that I will be successful in my journey, the statue would go, See, the statue moved. The statue's come alive. It's a sign. Or a priest would be inside it, throwing their voice. Yes, I shall be with you. And they had other ones. They had tricks that came with water, so that statues cried, like what do you call her, Diana, or Artemis. She would sometimes cry, or she would even have milk coming out of her 100 breasts that she had on top, Or they would have things where fire would suddenly appear. It was all done with powder and stuff like that. And so they were real experts at kind of like creating these idols to and putting them in these dark rooms so that people would really they would really buy into it. You know, they would really give a big donation and all of that stuff to the temple. So let's just read Revelation 13. Now that you know that Nero was called the beast, by the way, Caesar Nero, or to say it in Latin, Neron Kaiser, adds up from using Hebrew gematria, which is where each letter, I mean, even the Romans did that, you know, like Roman numerals or letters. So, like, if you think of it this way, same in Hebrew, same in Aramaic, if you think of it like A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, you know, each letter of the alphabet has a numerical value until you get up to 10, and then it becomes 20, 30, 100, and all that kind of stuff. So, Neron Kaiser adds up to 666, 666, when the Hebrew gematria is translated into Greek. But when it's translated into Latin, it adds up to 616. If you've got a good study Bible, you'll have a footnote that says, where it says that the number of the beast is 666. You'll have a footnote there that says, a few ancient translations say 616. That's the Latin ones, because it wouldn't work if they put 666 in. So they have to change it so that you still know that it's Nero that it's been talking about, because in Latin it's 616. Okay, so here we go. Revelation 13, the beast out of the sea. The dragon, who we know is the devil, stood on the shore of the sea. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on its horns, and on each of its head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and the mouth like those of a lion. Now, if you know the prophecies of Daniel, you know that those animals and those symbols mean it's the Roman Empire. Okay? So, the dragon gave the beast, or the devil gave the Roman emperor, his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound was healed. This was the head of state that was in power at the time, Nero, because the emperor, he was the emperor that brought back, that revived emperor worship that had been killed off before then. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. Well, the Roman Empire at that point covered the whole known world. People worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshipped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? That was a common saying. Who can wage war against Rome? That was a common saying at the time. Oh, I'm really unhappy with the tax that Rome has now put on us. But who can wage war against Rome? That was a common saying. Rome was so powerful that people said, who can wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority, oh my goodness, for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe, people, and language and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, meaning the known world, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed by the sword, with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. So God's people were going to go through a really tough time under the rulership of Nero. They were going to have to be patient, they were going to have to endure it, and some of them were going to be killed with a sword. Some were going to go into captivity like John did in Patmos. The beast out of the earth. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. You realize that pagan religion is earth-based religion, right? And actually, you can go to Ephesus and you can go to the temple of Diana or Artemis. And it was all based on, you would actually go there and you would go down they've dug it all up and archaeologists have laid it all out. You would go down these steps. So you would go into the temple and you would pray to Diana and you would ask her to help you out and so on. And you'd probably be given something to drink and it could probably be laced with something. And then you would go down these steps underground into this cavern under the ground where you would sleep that night. And it's got all of these little channels of water. You know how you can get an app on your phone that will help you go to sleep and it will have a babbling brook or something like that and it will get you into a meditative state? Well, they did the same thing but with real water, and they channeled all the water a particular way to get you into this kind of sleepy state, and you would have a dream down there, and the dream was supposed to be the answer to your, whatever you were told in the dream was the answer to your prayer that you'd prayed to Diana. And it was all to do with with air pressure and with being underground and with water. It's all earth-based religion. So the beast of the earth comes out. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf. So this is the priesthood of the pagan imperial cult exercising authority on behalf of Nero to persecute the Christians. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads so that they could not buy or sell. They couldn't enter the marketplace unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. I've only really got time for one last image, and I think I've got two images left here. Okay, I'm going to do one last image, and it's the 1,000 years. The 1,000 years. So, in Revelation 19, we've got this picture of Jesus coming on a white horse in the clouds with all the armies of heaven after him. And again, if we're going to project all of these visions into the future, I've heard people say, oh, that's the second coming of Jesus. And I've seen pictures of like the second coming of Jesus on a white horse, riding on a white horse. And it's funny because when Jesus ascended to heaven, the angel said to the disciples, he shall come in exactly the same way as you saw him go. Well, he never went on a white horse. He didn't stand in the Mount of Olives and say, what are you doing? I'm waiting for Pegasus. And then I'll jump on him and off I'll go, It's Revelation 19 with Jesus coming on a white horse with the armies of heaven following him. And it says he has a sharp, double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. And his name is, I actually saw the picture of a book. And it was about the second coming of Jesus. And it had him on a white horse. And he looked like a maniac. He had fiery, angry eyes. And he had a big metal sword sticking out of his mouth, as if he was going to come and chop everyone's heads off. It's a symbolic picture. Jesus does not have a sword in his mouth. And then it says, and his name is the Word of God. You know how in Hebrews it says, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. The sword in his mouth is the word in his mouth. It is the prophetic word. And Jesus coming on a white horse with the armies of heaven, if you read Revelation 19 in context, that is about the destruction of Babylon. And Babylon, the harlot, is Jerusalem. This is talking about the fall of Jerusalem and Jerusalem being destroyed. The reason he has the sword in his mouth and not in his hand is because Jesus didn't kill anybody. It was the Roman armies that killed the people. But Jesus prophesied it. Jesus predicted it. The Word of God is his prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem and how that prophecy was a double-edged sword. For the people of Jerusalem who rejected him, the prophecy meant they would be killed by the Romans. For the people who accepted Jesus' new covenant, the prophecy meant they would be part of the new Jerusalem, the new order of things. And I think I mentioned this last time, but if I didn't, if you look up and if you don't have the book, which most people you won't, you can get the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, but you can read them online too. And Josephus records that at the time that Titus was invading Jerusalem and at the time Jerusalem fell, and not only does Josephus record it, but a lot of other Roman historians recorded it too, that both the people in the city of Jerusalem and the Roman soldiers saw a vision in the clouds of riders on horseback. And General Titus said to his troops, "This city is about to fall, and it is not by our own power, but I discern that an avenging God is bringing their just deserts upon them." He saw the hand of God in the fall of Jerusalem after seeing this vision. And so this is the fall of Jerusalem. And right after the fall of Jerusalem, right after that, we then have 1,000 years. We have a long time. So let's have a look at this. 1,000 in Jewish or Hebraic is a Jewish or Hebraic figure of speech, which just means unlimited. It's similar to today that we would say millions. You say, "Oh my goodness, there were millions of people at that event yesterday." But there weren't. There were 2,000, But you're saying millions because we use exaggerated language. They did the same, but they used the word 1,000 as their exaggerated language. And the Bible uses it. Look, Psalm 50, verse 10. "For all of the animals of the forest are mine, and I own the cattle on 1,000 hills." Now, what do you think God's saying there? Is God saying that he only owns the cattle on 1,000 hills? Or is he saying he owns the cattle on every hill everywhere? 1,000 hills means all the hills. Otherwise, we could just start counting them off, 1, 2, and once we got to hill 1,001, we could say, "That's mine, it's not God's. He's only got 1,000. But it's obviously a figure of speech. It means that God owns all the cattle and all the hills, right? Or, "May the Lord multiply you 1,000 times more and bless you as he promised." It just means unlimited blessings. Or how about this? "A single day in your court is better than 1,000 elsewhere. But if I could just have 1,001 in Hawaii, that'd be better than heaven any time." That one extra day would tip the scale. No, it wouldn't. That means a day in God's presence is better than every day anywhere else. And 1,000 years just means all the years. It's a very common figure of speech. By the way, see this idea that the 1,000 years in Revelation literally means 1,000 years, and it's going to be sometime in the future when Jesus will rule from Jerusalem for a literal 1,000 years. Do you know who the first person to actually put forward that interpretation was? It was a guy that we'll find out next week John calls the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. Cerinthus was his name, and he was the first person to propose a literal. When John was sending these visions to Asia Minor and it was being passed around, he put himself forward as a great interpreter of John's visions and said, "Yes, Jesus will return and he will rule for a literal 1,000 years from Jerusalem." And when John leaves Patmos and comes back to Ephesus, he starts writing letters and says, "Don't listen to anything that guy says. He is an antichrist and he is not of the Spirit of God." Just an interesting thought. So, it says that Satan will be bound at the beginning of the 1,000 years and loosed at the end. I saw Satan loosed as an Eastern way of saying, "I saw evil prevail." This is a quote from Dr. George Lamsa, the Aramaic scholar. "I saw evil prevail." Satan tied up and chained means evil has been conquered and truth has prevailed. The chain is symbolic of truth, which suppresses deception. John Calvin said it this way. He said, "Satan is bound by a chain. He won't be bound in the future. He is bound now." Jesus said in Luke's gospel, "I have come to bind Satan and plunder his goods." Now, either he did it or he didn't. Either he succeeded or he failed. Now, John Calvin said, Satan is bound in a chain. It's a long chain. It's like a dog being bound in a chain. And if you stand back there and the vicious dog is here, rah, 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 it can't touch you. But if you get within chain's length of it, you're going to get your rear end bit. And if you mess with the dark side of the force, you're going to get bitten. Do you know what I mean? But as long as you stay out of it, Satan cannot touch you. And he was bound at the first coming of Jesus and will be destroyed at the second coming of Jesus. He is bound in a chain, and he's put in a bottomless pit. You do realize that that's a symbol. There's no such thing as a bottomless pit. That's a tunnel. If it's not got a bottom, it'd be a tunnel from here to China or whatever. It's impossible. A pit has a bottom, or it's not a pit. The very language tells you that it is a symbol, okay? And he's cast into the lake of fire at the second coming. It's a partial binding. People say, well, how can you say Satan is bound because there's evil in the world and not? Yeah, it doesn't say he's bound in every way possible. It says he's bound in one way particular. He is bound so that he can deceive the nations no longer. If you look at before Jesus came, all of the nations were deceived. They were all worshipping demonic gods. I mean, the Aztecs, the Mayans, and if you go to India, you could go to Africa, they're all worshipping these hideous gods, many of them serpent gods or dragon gods. They're performing human sacrifices to. I mean, the world was covered in religious darkness. Even the one nation of Israel, this tiny little nation that worshipped the true God, every 30 or 40 years, they were falling into paganism and worshipping Baal and throwing their kids in the fire to Molech and all that stuff. But after the time of Jesus, the gospel has advanced. No religion has been able to stop it. No government has been able to stop it. No army has been able to stop it. He can deceive the nations no more since the coming of Christ. Here's Matthew 12, where Jesus said, I am casting out demons by the Spirit of God, so the kingdom of God has arrived among you. For who is powerful enough to enter the house of a strong man like Satan and plunder his goods? Only someone even stronger, someone who could bind him up and then plunder his house. Jesus is saying that through his ministry, his death and resurrection, he has bound Satan. He has restricted him. John 12:31. The time for judging the world has come when Satan, the ruler of this world, will be cast out. Hebrews 2:14. Because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. Satan's not going to be defeated in the future. He was defeated at the cross and at the resurrection. Also, this 1,000 years, it talks about two resurrections. The two resurrections, two deaths, and the first death and the second death, the first resurrection and the second resurrection. That's spiritual and physical. We have already, when in the Garden of Eden story, when Adam sinned, God says, in the day that you eat of the fruit, you shall die. But he didn't die the day he ate the fruit. What it literally says in Hebrew is, the day that you eat of the fruit, dying, you shall die. Which what it means is, you will die in some way right away, and then you will eventually die physically. You will die spiritually. The moment you reject God and sin, you die spiritually, and eventually you will die physically. So there's a spiritual death first, which results in a physical death. And there is a spiritual resurrection. The moment we receive Christ, we are born again. We are resurrected spiritually. And one day, at the second coming of Christ, we will be resurrected physically. So there's the two deaths and the two resurrections. Ephesians says, even though we were dead because of our sins, he gave us life when he raised Christ from the dead. If we love our Christian brothers and sisters, it proves that we have passed from death to life. But a person who has no love is still dead. Anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old is gone and a new life has begun. This second resurrection, this resurrection at the end, so the 1,000 years basically is everything between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. It's already been 2,000 years. It's not a literal 1,000 years. Everything between Jesus' first coming, because at his first coming he bound the enemy. At his second coming he will destroy the enemy. At his first coming he brought the first resurrection, the new birth. At his second coming he will bring the second resurrection. And at the second resurrection, everyone, when Christ returns, everyone will stand before him, good and bad, righteous and unrighteous. John tells us all will rise when they hear the voice of the Son of God. And then it talks about these people being seated on thrones in heavenly places. That's us now. We are now seated with Christ in heavenly places. Ephesians 2:6, he raised us from the dead along with Christ and seated us with him in heavenly realms because we are united with Christ. So we've got most of Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 23, 4 and 5 was about events that were going to happen within one generation. And most of the prophecies of the book of Revelation are about events that were going to happen very soon. Then Jesus tells us there's going to be a long time when the bridegroom is delayed in his return. And during that long time, our job is to advance the kingdom of God, to share the gospel. We are living that long time right now. And Revelation says there will be 1,000 years, which is just symbolic of a long time between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. And then at the end of Jesus' prophecy, at the end of the book of Revelation, we have when you see the bride descending, the New Jerusalem descending like a bride from heaven, this is all of God's people, all of the church of Jesus Christ returning with him, descending from heaven with him at his return. And so after this long time, there is the return of Christ. There's no wars and rumors of wars. There's no Antichrist. There's no beast then. All of that stuff is past. All there is now is we have a kingdom which is advancing, 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 advancing until eventually it fills the whole earth. We'll see this next week. Daniel said the kingdom of God will be like, it starts off really small, but it will become a mountain that fills the whole earth. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And Paul tells us once God's kingdom has filled all things, and once all of God's enemies are a footstool for his feet, then Jesus will return and get rid of the last enemy, which is death, by raising everyone back to life again. And then we have the whole new order of things, when God shall be all and shall dwell in all. And I'm stopping just 4 minutes late. I think I did quite good. And there we're stopping right now. So if you've got a question, come up and ask me here, because I need to let you go. I need to dismiss.